Hello friends, my name is Maxim. I have been keeping bees for about 3 years. I can't call myself a professional in this field, but I definitely know how things work inside a beehive and what interesting things can be found there. And I'm confident that I can explain all the processes to beginners, to people who are just starting out or already have bees but don't really understand this business. Briefly, clearly, and as interestingly as possible. I hope we'll succeed in this, but for that, we're now going to move to another apiary. By the way, an apiary site is called a tochuk. It's the place where the beehives are kept, where the apiary is located. By the way, right now our apiary is set up in a sunflower field, as you can see, and the other apiary is a bit smaller, where we have small bee colonies that we'll experiment with, and I'll show you using them. Examples. It's located in a different place. And where are we heading now? Alright friends, now we're already at the apiary where we'll be working and figuring out how a bee colony is organized and what they have on the frames. We'll start inspecting the brood nest from the second frame. This is the right way to do it, because if we take out the outermost frame, the one closest to the wall, then some of the bees might get a bit crushed right against it. Now take a close look at this. First of all, when we pull out the wooden frame, what we see are all the busy bees crawling around on the surface of the frame. In general, you could definitely say that these frames are just like the walls or the floor of the bee's house. The bees don't fly inside the hive, instead they move around through the cells. And the cells themselves can either be filled with something or be empty. So essentially for them, it's just like different rooms in a house. The majority of bees in the hive are worker bees. They actually make up about 99% of the entire hive's total population. These diligent worker bees are responsible for bringing in honey, collecting sweet nectar, cleaning out the cells, guarding the hive entrance, and performing many other essential tasks. Bees have many different roles, with individuals working in various areas throughout their entire bee lives. There is also a certain number of drones in the hive. Drones are quite easy to distinguish from the smaller worker bees because drones possess notably large eyes and a much bigger body. The primary role of the drone is that of the male within the hive. His specific job is to fertilize the queen bee, essentially to inseminate her when she goes out on her important mating flight. When the queen is still young and unfertilized, in order for her to start laying eggs and producing new bees, she needs to go on a mating flight. So we've touched on the topic of the queen bee. There is also only one queen in the hive. Well, sometimes there can be two, but that's a topic for another video. The queen bee is the foundation of the bee colony because she lays the eggs, and thanks to her, new bees are born. Alright, we've covered the bees, so let's move on to what's inside the cells. Now we've pulled out the second frame, as I mentioned we would. It's a honey frame, or honey and bee bread. Look, at the front, everything we see here, there's a large amount of bee bread. What is bee bread? Bee bread is, as you can clearly see here, actually just compressed pollen. The industrious bees collect fine pollen from various flowers, gather it securely on their hind legs, and then bring it all back to the hive. Once there, they carefully mix it with sweet nectar and pack it tightly into the honeycomb cells. Then, they use this nutrient-rich mixture to feed the growing larvae. This is one of the stages in the development of a bee. First, there is the tiny egg, which we will get to know better a bit later. Then comes the growing larva, and after that stage, the larva is sealed inside, and a young bee finally emerges. Right now, we can also see these very larvae right here. These are already quite mature larvae. Also, on this specific frame, we can see a certain number of eggs that the queen has already laid. We won't dwell on the bees right now. A bit later, we'll move on and see the sealed bees. Right now, we can see that besides bee bread, there is also nectar here. Bees diligently collect sweet nectar from various flowers, just like they do with bee bread. But then, much later on, they carefully turn that nectar into delicious honey. How does this process happen? Flower nectar contains a large amount of moisture. And over time, the bees evaporate this moisture, and the nectar turns into honey. Then they seal it up tightly, and the honey can be stored for a very long time under this protective seal. Alright, let's set this first frame aside for now and take a closer look at the next one. The next frame we have, as you can see, is quite light, while the previous frame was dark in color. It all depends on how many bees were born in this frame. Because when a bee is born, the cell is sealed, and then the bee emerges from the sealed cell. A small developing larva is tucked away inside its cocoon, and the more bees are successfully hatched, the more cocoons there will be in the cell, which is why the color of the frame changes. Now in the next frame we see brood of different ages, and it's specifically worker bee brood, not drone brood. We'll find some a bit further on and then talk about it in much more detail. Here we have something very interesting to observe. There are eggs, there are larvae of many different ages, but there are still no sealed cells to be found yet. This clearly indicates that the queen is healthy and laying very well, carefully placing eggs from which the worker bees then raise the young larvae over time. We will need to find... This is a frame filled with capped brood. Right here we have a small amount of brood that is just beginning to emerge. You can see a young honey bee that is currently hatching from its cell. This is what bee brood looks like. It is flat, level with the comb. How can you tell it apart from capped honey? It's quite simple. Because when honey is capped, it has a certain texture. It's uneven, wavy. When you observe the capped bee brood, you can clearly see every single cell. Notice how each individual cell has been carefully sealed over, which is very easy to see. Now, let us search for some examples of capped drone brood so that we can understand how these drone cells differ in their appearance from the regular worker bee cells. So here we have a frame that's fully and completely capped. By the way, one of the most important things to check in a beehive, and something you should really pay close attention to, is how well the queen is laying her eggs in the frame. You need to look in terms of her not skipping any cells, because if she lays eggs sparsely or unevenly, it means there is a problem. This indicates that she already has some health issues, and most likely she should be replaced soon. Here we can see a very dense and solid brood pattern, with no gaps or empty cells at all. On this specific frame, there is also plenty of fully capped brood. As I previously mentioned, the very center of the nest always contains this capped brood. And right here, we also have several drone cells. A drone cell is very easy to distinguish from others because it has a distinctively domed shape. That is exactly why it is also commonly called domed drone brood. It has this dome texture, but when we look at worker brood, it is uniform, meaning it's flat across the entire surface of the comb. So on the next frame, we also notice capped brood. By the way, you should also pay close attention to whether there are any problems with the brood, such as if it has been chilled, or if you notice any gaps or irregularities in the cappings. This could indicate that there are some issues or diseases affecting the brood. That will be a topic for another video, but it's something you need to watch for. This is one of the very important aspects when inspecting a hive, to check whether the brood is chilled or not. When inspecting the hive, it's not always necessary to look for the queen. It is quite sufficient to see a brood of young offspring of different ages, or even simply a single egg. The egg we see can be positioned perfectly upright or perhaps slightly tilted. That is, for 3 days it remains standing upright. On the next day it tilts over just a little, and on the third day it lies down flat. Then the bees feed it with a special kind of royal milk, thanks to which the egg turns into a larva. From it, a bee will eventually grow. To understand the health of a bee colony, it's not necessary for us to find the queen. After all, we can clearly see that the queen is actively laying eggs, which definitely means the queen is present. There is certainly a queen in the hive, because from the very moment the queen lays the egg and we see it, exactly 1, 2, or 3 days have passed. In fact, to be honest, it's not even strictly necessary for us to see the egg. We can spot a tiny larva instead, and accordingly we understand that the queen is laying quite well, and that's not a problem for the bee colony. Now let's develop a comprehensive checklist that we will go through when inspecting the hive. The very first thing that you need to carefully observe and monitor when inspecting the hive is whether the bees have enough food. This means checking for the presence of nectar or honey, because without it they won't be able to survive. Next, you need to pay attention to whether there is a healthy queen present. It's not necessary to actually find her to understand this. It will be enough for you to see a sufficient number of eggs or larvae. In other words, to understand that she is working and doing her job properly. Well, and that there are absolutely no visible signs of decline or any other similar issues. Next, you should carefully observe and monitor the activity or temperament of the bees. Whether they have a good flight from the entrance and whether they are not showing aggression towards you. After all, if they are aggressive, it could mean that they don't have a queen or that something else is going on with them. Something is not right in the hive. We can talk about this in more detail another time. If you leave comments, we will definitely discuss this topic. Next, you need to pay attention to the availability of free space in the hive, because if there isn't enough room, if the bees have nowhere to store pollen, nectar or honey, or nowhere to lay eggs, in other words, if there is too little space in the hive, they will start to swarm. Alternatively, if there is too much empty space within the hive, which simply means that the bees are unable to adequately cover all the frames, then the larvae may get chilled and serious problems with the brood can start. You absolutely need to monitor this so that the bees are neither overcrowded nor overextended in the hive. And taking all these points into account, you can create your own logical chains when inspecting a bee colony and work to ensure that your bees develop well, produce honey for you, and bring you both satisfaction and benefits for nature. Friends, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like. Leave a comment and give it a like. And if you're interested in a more specific topic, whether it's about brood or maybe about varroa mites, there are actually a lot of topics. If there's something in particular you're curious about, leave your questions in the comments. I'll definitely do my best to make a video about it for you. See you next time. Take care.